The day I found out my HOA president expected me to heat her personal barn with my geothermal system was the day I realized suburban living in Pennsylvania had reached peak insanity. I'm Adrian Owens, and I'd been living in the Meadowbrook Estates development outside Pittsburgh for 3 years. My property sat on 5 acres at the edge of the community, grandfathered in from before the HOA existed. When I bought the place, the real estate agent assured me the HOA had minimal authority over my land since I technically predated their charter. That turned out to be both true and the source of endless friction with our HOA president, Patricia Morrison, who believed her authority extended to every blade of grass within a 5-mile radius. The trouble started innocently enough. I'd installed a state-of-the-art geothermal heating and cooling system the previous fall. The installation cost me nearly $40,000, but between the tax credits and reduced energy bills, it would pay for itself in about 8 years. More importantly, it kept my 1920s farmhouse comfortable year-round without the noise and expense of traditional HVAC. The system used a series of underground pipes that exchanged heat with the Earth's constant temperature, incredibly efficient and environmentally friendly. My property included the main house, a detached garage, and a small workshop. What it didn't include was the decrepit barn sitting about 20 feet over my property line, firmly on HOA common land. That barn had been empty for decades, used occasionally by the previous landowner for storage before the development bought up the surrounding parcels. The HOA owned it now, though they'd never done anything with it except let it slowly rot. Patricia had other ideas. It was a Tuesday morning in January when she showed up at my door, tablet in hand, and her signature pearl necklace catching the weak winter sunlight. Her silver hair was styled in that aggressive bob that seemed to be standard issue for HOA presidents nationwide, and she wore a cream-colored pantsuit despite the temperature hovering around 15 degrees. "Adrian, we need to discuss your heating system," she announced before I could even say hello. "Good morning to you too, Patricia. What about it?" She tapped her tablet screen with a manicured nail. "I've been reviewing the property records and the installation permits you filed. Your geothermal loops extend under HOA property." This was true. When the installation company laid the underground piping, they needed to cover a large area to maximize efficiency. Part of that area crossed into the HOA land by about 15 feet, which I'd gotten written permission for from the HOA board. Patricia herself had signed off on it. Yes, and the board approved it in writing. I have the documents if you need to see them again. "I'm aware of the approval," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone that suggested I was being deliberately obtuse. "What I'm here to discuss is the barn. Since your heating infrastructure crosses onto our property and provides warming to the ground beneath our barn, I expect you to extend that service to actually heat the barn itself." I stared at her. "You want me to heat an empty barn? It's not empty. We're going to use it for HOA storage and community events starting this spring. But the pipes are completely frozen, and we need to get the building habitable. Since you're already using our land for your system, it's only fair you extend the service." "Patricia, that's not how geothermal heating works. The pipes underground are a closed loop. They're not radiating heat into the surrounding soil, they're exchanging heat. And even if I wanted to extend HVAC into that barn, it would require running ductwork, installing air handlers, and basically rebuilding half the system. We're talking about $20,000 or $30,000. She smiled, and it wasn't friendly. "Then I suggest you find a cost-effective solution, because the board voted last night, and we're requiring you to provide heating to the barn. Since your infrastructure is already utilizing our property, you're obligated to ensure that utilization doesn't damage our structures. The frozen pipes constitute damage. The frozen pipes constitute normal winter conditions for an unheated building. That's not my responsibility. Patricia's smile vanished. Check your CC and Articus, Adrian. Any property owner whose improvements extend onto common land must ensure those improvements don't create hazards or damage. Your heating system altered the ground temperature patterns, and now our barn is suffering. You have until Friday to begin providing heat, or we'll fine you $500 per day. She turned and walked back to her white Lexus before I could respond, leaving me standing in my doorway in sweatpants and a bathrobe, cold air pouring into my house. I spent the rest of that day reviewing every document related to my property, the HOA, and the geothermal installation. The CC and Rs, or covenants, conditions, and restrictions, were the governing rules of the HOA. Mine were particularly complex because my property predated the association. Nowhere in any document could I find language that supported Patricia's claim. The approval for my ground loops crossing the property line specifically stated that the HOA waived any claims related to the installation and operation of the system. I called my lawyer, George Katz, who'd handled my property purchase and had experience with HOA disputes. "She's bluffing," George said after I explained the situation. "The waiver is ironclad. They can't require you to heat their building, and they certainly can't fine you for not doing it. If they try, we'll fight it and win." "But they could make things difficult in the meantime," I said. "Probably. That's Patricia's specialty. How much are your heating bills now?" I pulled up my utility account. "Last month was $83 for electric to run the heat pump. And to heat that barn too. I'd have to get quotes, but figure at least tripling my system's capacity. The barn's not insulated. It's basically heating the outdoors. My bills would probably go up $300 or $400 a month, plus the installation costs." George whistled. "Definitely fight this. I'll draft a response to the board citing the waiver agreement. Don't do anything until you hear from me." Friday came and went. I didn't provide heat to the barn because that would require physically installing equipment I didn't have and couldn't afford. Monday morning, I found a violation notice on my door. $500 fine, effective immediately, accruing daily. I called George. He sent a certified letter to the HOA board explaining in legal terms why they could go pound sand. Patricia responded by increasing the fine to $750 per day, claiming I was now in willful violation after being informed of my obligations. "This is harassment," I told George during our next call. "Yes, and we can prove it. Start documenting everything. Every interaction, every notice, every communication. We're building a case here." But Patricia wasn't done escalating. She showed up again the following Thursday with a man I didn't recognize, someone in his 50s wearing an expensive coat and carrying a briefcase. "Adrian, this is Robert Chen, our HOA attorney. We need to discuss immediate remediation." I looked at Robert. He had the slightly uncomfortable expression of a lawyer who knew his client was on shaky ground but was being paid too well to say so. "Mr. Owens," Robert began, "while there are some questions about the legal interpretations here, the HOA board believes in good faith that your system may be contributing to infrastructure damage on common property. They're willing to offer a compromise." "I'm listening." "If you'll agree to provide minimal heating to prevent pipe damage through the rest of winter, the HOA will cover 50% of installation costs and will waive the accrued fines. Come spring, we can have an independent assessment done to determine long-term responsibilities." It was actually a reasonable offer, which surprised me. Patricia looked like she was chewing glass. "How minimal is minimal?" I asked. "Enough to keep the temperature above freezing. 40 degrees would be sufficient." I thought about it. The barn was maybe 800 square feet. With some creative ductwork and a small auxiliary heater, I could probably manage it without destroying my budget. Split costs would make it almost reasonable. I need to get quotes first, and I want the agreement in writing, including the part about the independent assessment. Robert nodded. "That's fair. Shall we say you have 2 weeks to arrange the work?" Patricia started to object, but Robert gave her a sharp look. Whatever she'd been paying him, she wasn't happy about his reasonableness. "2 weeks works," I said. They left, and I called George to tell him about the compromise. "It's a trap," he said immediately. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. They get you to install heating, which establishes precedent that you accept responsibility for the barn. Then the independent assessment will be someone they hire who'll say you need to keep heating it indefinitely. And you'll have already spent thousands of your own money on their building." Robert seems reasonable, though. Robert's a hired gun. He's reasonable because it makes his client's unreasonable position sound legitimate. "Don't do this, Adrian. Tell them no, and let's take it to court if we have to." I wanted to fight. I really did. But I also didn't want to spend the next year in litigation with my HOA. I lived here. I had to see these people. And part of me wondered if maybe there was a legitimate issue with the pipes in the barn, even if I wasn't legally responsible. Against George's advice, I got quotes for the heating work. The cheapest option came in at $8,000. That meant $4,000 out of my pocket and the HOA covering the other $4,000. It hurt, but it was better than the alternative. I was about to accept the compromise when I actually went to look at the barn. I'd walked past it hundreds of times but never really examined it closely. It was an old structure, probably original to the farmland before development. The wood was weathered gray, and several boards were missing from the sides. The roof sagged in the middle. When I walked around to the back, I found the door partially open and went inside. The barn was completely empty except for some old hay bales in one corner and a collection of rusted farm tools. What caught my attention were the pipes. They ran along one wall, exposed copper that had gone green with age. I followed them and found where they connected to the main water supply. The pipes weren't frozen. They were bone dry. I traced the plumbing further and discovered someone had shut off the water supply to the barn months ago. The valve was inside a small utility box, and it was firmly in the closed position. The valve itself had a tag on it dated October with initials I didn't recognize. Patricia had lied. There was no frozen pipe damage because there was no water in the pipes to freeze. I took extensive photos and videos, documenting everything. Then I called George. "She fabricated the entire emergency," I told him. "The pipes are empty. They winterized the barn. There's no damage." George was quiet for a moment. "That's fraud. She lied to justify the fines and force you into a contract. This changes everything." "What do? We go nuclear. I'll file a motion to invalidate all the fines and notices, and we'll include your evidence. Then we're going to demand the HOA reimburse you for legal fees and formally apologize. And if Patricia doesn't resign, we'll push for it." The next few days were satisfying in the way that being vindicated always is, but they were also nerve-wracking. George filed his motion and sent a copy to the HOA board along with all my documentation. The board called an emergency meeting, which I attended. The meeting was in Patricia's living room, which should have been neutral HOA space, but nobody seemed to care about the rules when it was convenient to break them. The board consisted of Patricia, the vice president named Donald Hertz, secretary Janice Matthews, and treasurer Kevin Ford. George came with me. We sat on one side of Patricia's coffee table while the board sat on the other side. The atmosphere was arctic. "Let's get to the point," Patricia said. "Your accusations are inflammatory and baseless." George opened his tablet and pulled up my photos. These are time-stamped images from 3 days ago showing the interior of the barn. As you can see, the pipes are not only not frozen, they're empty. The water supply was shut off in October. He zoomed in on the tag. "These appear to be your initials, Mrs. Morrison." Patricia's face went red. "We winterized as a precaution. That doesn't change the fact that Adrian's system altered the ground conditions. You claimed frozen pipes were causing damage. You fined my client thousands of dollars for an emergency that didn't exist. That's fraud." Donald cleared his throat. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who usually just nodded along with whatever Patricia said. "Now, let's not throw around words like fraud. There may have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I said, speaking up for the first time. "She showed up at my house and demanded I heat your barn. When I said no, she threatened me with fines. When I still said no, she actually started fining me. Then she brought a lawyer and offered a compromise, all based on damage that never existed. What part of that is a misunderstanding?" Janice, the youngest board member at maybe 45, looked uncomfortable. "Patricia, is this true? Did you know the pipes were winterized when you talked to Adrian?" "Of course I knew. I'm the one who authorized it, but that's not the point." "That's exactly the point," George interjected. "You knowingly made false claims to justify punitive action against my client. You've violated your fiduciary duty to the HOA, you've harassed a homeowner, and you've committed fraud. My client is within his rights to sue you personally, not just the HOA." The meeting deteriorated from there. Kevin, who'd been silent, finally spoke up and said he wanted the board to consult with Robert Chen before proceeding. Donald agreed. Patricia was outvoted on calling a recess, but the meeting ended without resolution. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. George had exposed the lies. The board was clearly uncomfortable, and I figured Patricia would be forced to back down. Instead, things got weird. 2 days after the board meeting, I came home to find the water supply to my house had been shut off. The shutoff valve was on HOA property, part of the main line that served several houses including mine. I called the water company and they said they had no record of any shutoff. Someone had manually turned the valve. I turned it back on. The next day, it was off again. The day after that, someone filed a complaint with the county saying I was running a commercial geothermal operation without proper permits. This triggered an inspection that cost me a day of work and $300 in inspection fees, even though the inspector found nothing wrong and confirmed my permits were in order. Then my garbage pickup stopped. The HOA contracted with the waste management company for the whole development, and somehow my address got removed from the pickup list. It took me a week of phone calls to get it restored. Patricia was waging a campaign of petty sabotage, and it was working. Each individual incident was minor, but together they were making my life miserable. She was careful too, never doing anything that could be directly traced back to her. George sent another letter, this time threatening a lawsuit for harassment. The incident stopped for about 2 weeks, and I started to relax. That was my mistake. I came home from work on a Monday in late February to find Patricia, Donald, and a plumber I didn't recognize standing in my driveway. The plumber was looking at the ground where my geothermal loops were buried. "What's going on?" I asked, getting out of my truck. Patricia smiled that terrible smile. "The board has decided to perform maintenance on the common land. We're digging up the section where your pipes are located." "Your what?" The plumber, a young guy who looked extremely uncomfortable, said, "Sir, I'm just doing what I was hired for. They want to install a drainage system." "There's no drainage problem there." "Patricia, what are you really doing?" "I told you, maintenance. If your pipes happen to be in the way, well, you shouldn't have installed them on our property without proper consideration for our needs." My hands clenched. "You approved that installation. We have it in writing. We approved temporary usage. We're now exercising our right to use our own land. If that requires removing obstacles, so be it." Donald looked at the ground, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to contradict Patricia. The plumber just seemed like he wanted to be anywhere else. I pulled out my phone and called George. While it rang, I said, "Don't touch anything until my lawyer gets here." Patricia's smile widened. "We have every right to work on our own property. But fine, we'll wait. The plumber charges by the hour, though, so every minute you delay is costing the HOA money." "I'll make sure that's reflected in your dues," George answered, and I explained the situation. He said he'd be there in 30 minutes and told me to start recording everything. I switched my phone to video mode and documented the whole scene. Patricia and Donald standing there, the plumber's truck, the stakes they'd already put in the ground marking where they planned to dig. The stakes were directly over my geothermal loops. "For the record," I said to the camera and to Patricia, "if you dig there, you'll destroy a $40,000 heating system. That's not maintenance, that's vandalism." "That's your choice to make," Patricia said sweetly. "You can remove your pipes from our property before we dig, or you can leave them and accept the consequences. Either way, we're installing our drainage system." George arrived 28 minutes later, and he brought someone with him. A woman in her 50s wearing a blazer and carrying a briefcase. "This is Rebecca Sutton," George said. "She's with the county planning office. Rebecca, would you like to tell them what you told me?" Rebecca pulled out a document. "I've reviewed the HOA's proposal for drainage work, which was filed this morning. The work requires a permit because it involves significant ground disturbance on property adjacent to an existing geothermal installation. The permit application is incomplete and hasn't been approved. If you proceed with this work without a permit, the HOA will be fined, the work will be forced to stop, and you'll have to restore any damage at your own expense." Patricia's face went through several interesting color changes. "We own this land. We can maintain our own property." "Not without proper permits for this type of work," Rebecca said. "Pennsylvania law is very clear about this, especially when there's existing infrastructure involved. You need to file a complete application. There'll be a review period, and if approved, you'll need to coordinate with the owner of the existing geothermal system to ensure you don't cause damage." "How long is the review period?" Donald asked. "Typically 6 to 8 weeks. Patricia looked like she might explode. The plumber, sensing his payday evaporating, started packing up his equipment after they all left. George and I stood in my driveway. It was getting dark and the temperature was dropping. "She's going to keep coming," I said. "This isn't going to stop." "No, probably not. Patricia's the type who sees backing down as weakness. We need to either get her removed from the board or make this so expensive for her personally that she gives up." "How do we do that?" "We could sue for harassment. The pattern is clear. Or we could go to the other board members and convince them to force her out." I thought about it. "Both options take months. What do I do in the meantime?" George didn't have a good answer for that. March came in like a lion, with a late winter storm that dumped 8 inches of snow on Pittsburgh. I woke up on the first Saturday of the month to find my driveway blocked. Someone had plowed all the snow from the community road directly into my driveway entrance, creating a wall about 4 feet high. I had a snow blower, but this much snow would take me hours to clear. More importantly, it was clearly deliberate. The plow had made several passes to build up the wall, and there was a clear path around it where they could have pushed the snow into the drainage ditch instead. I called the HOA's contracted snow removal company. The dispatcher said they'd received specific instructions about my property. "What kind of instructions?" I asked. "I can't really say, sir. You'd have to talk to the HOA board." I called Patricia. She didn't answer. I called Donald. He hemmed and hawed, and finally admitted that Patricia had told the snow removal company that my driveway was private access and they shouldn't clear the approaches. "Donald, my driveway connects to the community road. Of course they have to clear the approach." I know. "Look, I didn't agree with this, but Patricia said it was about reducing costs." "That's bull and you know it. This is harassment, and if you go along with it, you're liable too." That got his attention. "Liable? My lawyer says the pattern of harassment is clear. Everyone who participates can be held personally responsible. That means your house, your savings, everything." Donald was quiet for a long moment. "I'll talk to her." "You do that." An hour later, the snow plow came back and cleared my driveway, but the damage was done. I'd missed a morning appointment because I couldn't get my truck out, and I'd spent 2 hours dealing with this nonsense instead of enjoying my Saturday. I decided I'd had enough. George wanted to build a case, but I wanted results, so I started thinking about the situation differently. Patricia wanted me to heat the barn. She'd lied about frozen pipes, tried to extort me, and when that failed, launched a harassment campaign. But underneath all of that was a simple fact. The barn was on HOA property and the HOA was responsible for it. I couldn't be forced to heat it. But I also couldn't stop them from trying to heat it themselves. Or could I? I went back and looked at the geothermal system documentation. My loops ran under a portion of the HOA land, true. But the system itself, the heat pump and all the mechanical components, were on my property. The loops were a closed system. No heat was leaking out to warm the HOA's land. The physics didn't work that way, but I'd been thinking about it wrong. Patricia didn't understand geothermal heating. She thought my pipes were like radiators warming the ground. That's why she thought she could demand I heat the barn. What if I made it clear, definitively, that my system provided exactly zero benefit to the HOA property? I called the geothermal installation company and asked about disconnecting the loops that cross the property line. The technician I spoke to said it was possible, but would reduce my system's efficiency by about 30%. How much would it cost to install replacement loops entirely on my property? I asked. To maintain your current capacity. Probably 15 to 20,000. We need to drill deeper since you have less horizontal space to work with. That was out of my budget, but I didn't need to actually do the work. I just needed Patricia to think I might. I had another idea though, a better one. The barn's water supply came from the same main line that fed my house. The shut-off valve that someone, probably Patricia, had turned off to winterize the barn was accessible from outside, in a utility box. That box was technically on HOA property, but the pipes leading to it came from the main line on my side of the property boundary. I wasn't a plumber, but I understood basic plumbing. The barn had its own branch off the main line, separate from my house supply. If that branch were to become disconnected, the barn would have no water service at all. And without water service, good luck getting any heating system to work, since most heating systems required water for humidity control or radiators. It was petty. It was possibly illegal. But after months of harassment, I was done playing nice. I called George first, though, because I wasn't completely crazy. "Don't do anything that could be construed as sabotage or vandalism," he warned immediately. "I'm not planning to." But hypothetically, if the barn's water service happened to be disconnected at the property line, and that disconnection was on my property, could the HOA force me to reconnect it? George was quiet for a bit. Where exactly is the connection point? I'd have to check, but I think it's on my side of the boundary. If you own the pipes and the connection is on your property, then no, they couldn't force you to maintain service to their building. But Adrian, be very careful here. If this looks like retaliation, it could hurt our case. What if I was just doing maintenance on my plumbing and discovered a leak that required shutting off that branch? Did you discover a leak? I might. George sighed. I can't advise you to do this, but I also can't stop you from maintaining your own property's plumbing on your own land. Just document everything, and if you do anything, make sure it's completely on your property. That Sunday, I went out to inspect my plumbing. The main water line came onto my property from the road, ran underground to my house, and had a junction box about 10 feet from the property boundary where the barn's supply branched off. The junction box was definitely on my property. I'd had it surveyed when I bought the place, and I had the survey stakes to prove it. The barn's supply line ran from that junction box to the HOA property. I dug down to the junction box, which took about an hour since the ground was still half frozen. Inside, I found exactly what I expected: a branching pipe with a valve controlling flow to the barn line. The valve was old, probably original to whenever the barn had water installed. The handle was corroded. When I tried to turn it, it didn't budge. I applied more pressure and the handle snapped off in my hand. Well, that was unfortunate and completely accidental. With the handle broken, there was no way to open the valve. The barn's water supply was now effectively disconnected, and it had happened due to equipment failure during routine inspection of my property's plumbing. I took extensive photos and videos documenting the broken valve, the condition of the pipes, and the location of everything relative to the property boundary. Then I called a plumber, my own this time, to come out and assess the situation. The plumber, a guy named Rick who I'd used before, looked at the broken valve and whistled. "This thing's ancient. Honestly surprised it didn't fail years ago. You want me to replace it? Not yet. I need to figure out if I'm even required to maintain service to that barn. It's HOA property." Rick nodded. "Your property, your pipes, your choice. If you want to cap this line, I can do that. Otherwise, a new valve is about $200 in parts and labor. Let me check with my lawyer. Can you document the failure?" Rick took his own photos and wrote up an inspection report detailing the valve failure. He noted that the valve had failed due to age and corrosion, and that the barn line was now non-functional until repairs were made. I paid him for the inspection and sent all the documentation to George. "This is either brilliant or going to blow up in your face," George said when I called him. "Which one?" "I'll let you know after Patricia responds." I didn't have to wait long. Monday evening, Patricia called me. She was livid. "What did you do to the barn's water?" "Hello, Patricia." "I'm fine, thanks for asking. How are you? Don't play games with me. The barn has no water and I know you're responsible." "Actually, my plumber inspected my property's plumbing and discovered a failed valve. These things happen with old equipment. Fix it, today." "I'm not sure that's my responsibility. The valve feeds a line to HOA property. Maybe the HOA should maintain their own water service." "That valve is on the main line. You can't shut off our water." "The valve is on my property, Patricia. I have a survey to prove it. The branch line to the barn splits off on my land. Whether I maintain that branch is up to me." She was breathing heavily. I could picture her face, red and furious. "This is illegal. You can't deny us utility access." "I'm not denying anything. I had a valve fail during routine maintenance. These things happen. If you'd like to discuss installing a new connection point that doesn't require running through my property, I'm happy to cooperate with that. You know damn well that would cost thousands of dollars. Yes, probably similar to what you wanted me to spend heating your barn. The silence stretched out. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was cold and controlled. You're going to regret this. She hung up. I immediately sent George a recording of the conversation. Pennsylvania was a two-party consent state for recording, but HOA matters had some exceptions, and George had advised me to document everything anyway, even if some recordings might not be admissible in court. The next escalation came fast. Wednesday morning, I found a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, Robert Chen. It demanded I restore water service to the barn within 24 hours or face legal action for interference with HOA property. George responded with our own letter explaining that I had no obligation to maintain plumbing on my property that served someone else's building, that the valve failure was accidental and documented, and that any attempt to force me to provide utilities to HOA property would be met with a countersuit for the harassment I'd endured. Thursday, the HOA filed an injunction seeking to force me to repair the valve. We had to go to court the following Tuesday. The hearing was in a Pittsburgh courthouse, a preliminary session in front of a judge to determine if the injunction had merit. Patricia showed up with Robert Chen and Donald. I came with George. Janice and Kevin were notably absent. Judge Martha Hendricks was a woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not suffering fools. She listened to Robert present the HOA's case, which boiled down to: Adrian disconnected our water service in retaliation for a dispute, and we need it restored. Then George presented our side, which included all the documentation of Patricia's harassment, the fraudulent frozen pipe claims, the attempted extortion, and finally, the documented valve failure that occurred during legitimate plumbing inspection on my property. Judge Hendricks looked at Patricia. Mrs. Morrison, did you or did you not falsely claim that frozen pipes in the barn required Mr. Owens to provide heating? Patricia's lawyer whispered something to her. She said, there was a misunderstanding about the condition of the pipes. That's not what I asked. Were the pipes frozen when you made your initial demands to Mr. Owens? No. And did you fine Mr. Owens thousands of dollars based on this false claim? The fine was for non-compliance with HOA requirements. Requirements you fabricated. Judge Hendricks looked at the documents in front of her. I'm seeing a pattern here that concerns me greatly. Mrs. Morrison, you appear to have engaged in a campaign of harassment against Mr. Owens, including false claims, improper fines, interference with his utilities, and attempted destruction of his property. Is that accurate? Robert Chen tried to intervene. Your Honor, the HOA's position is that there were legitimate disputes about property usage and responsibilities. Legitimate disputes don't involve lying about frozen pipes or trying to dig up someone's heating system without permits. Here's my ruling. The injunction is denied. Mr. Owens has no obligation to maintain plumbing on his property that serves the HOA's building. If the HOA wishes to restore water service to their barn, they can do so by installing their own connection from the main line, which they should have done in the first place, instead of relying on infrastructure that happens to cross someone else's property. She wasn't done. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order against the HOA board, specifically Mrs. Morrison, prohibiting any contact with Mr. Owens except through legal counsel, and prohibiting any actions that could be construed as harassment or retaliation. If I see this case again, because Mrs. Morrison has continued her behavior. I will not be pleased. Am I clear? Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Yes, Your Honor. Good. We're adjourned. I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. George was grinning. That went better than expected, he said. So what happens now? Now we wait and see if Patricia learned her lesson. The restraining order is enforceable. If she violates it, she can be held in contempt. For about 2 weeks, everything was quiet. I started to think maybe, finally, this was over. Then the pipes burst. It happened during a cold snap in mid-March. Temperatures dropped to single digits for 3 nights in a row. The barn, with no heat and no water, wasn't prepared for the extreme cold. The empty pipes that Patricia had winterized back in October apparently had some water left in low spots or traps, and that water froze and expanded. I didn't know anything had happened until Patricia violated the restraining order by showing up at my house. It was a Saturday morning and she was standing in my driveway when I left to get groceries. The pipes burst, she said without preamble. The barn flooded. There's thousands of dollars in damage. Then I guess you should file an insurance claim. This is your fault. You disconnected the water service. No, I had a valve fail on my property. The judge agreed I had no obligation to fix it, and you're violating the restraining order by being here. I don't care about the restraining order. You're going to pay for this damage. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Patricia, you need to leave my property now. You're not allowed to contact me except through your lawyer. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you that you're violating a court order. Leave now or I'm calling the police. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and stalked back to her car. As soon as she left, I called George and sent him the video. She just bought herself a contempt charge, George said. I'll file the paperwork today. But that wasn't the end of it. That afternoon, I went to look at the barn out of curiosity. What I saw shocked me. Water was still running. Not from broken pipes inside, but from the outside wall. Someone had attempted to install a temporary heating system, probably space heaters, and they'd reconnected the water supply somehow. But they'd done it wrong. A pipe had frozen anyway, burst, and now water was pouring out, creating a frozen waterfall down the side of the barn. The water had to be coming from the main line, which meant someone had either repaired the valve in my junction box or installed a bypass. I went to check. They'd done neither. Instead, they'd run a garden hose from my outdoor spigot, which was on the side of my house nearest the barn, across my property and into the barn. The hose was frozen solid in places, and water was leaking from several splits. Someone, probably Patricia or someone she'd hired, had stolen water from my house to supply the barn. They'd done it without permission, running a hose across my property and helping themselves to my utilities. I documented everything with photos and video. Then I shut off the outdoor spigot and disconnected the hose. The waterfall stopped. George was furious when I told him. That's theft of utilities. That's trespassing. That's so many things. We need to file a police report. So I did. A sheriff's deputy came out, took my statement, looked at the evidence, and wrote up a report. He said someone from the detective division would follow up. 2 days later, Detective Sarah Williams called me. She asked me to walk her through everything that had happened with the HOA, starting from Patricia's initial demand that I heat the barn. I spent an hour on the phone with her, and she asked me to email all my documentation. This is a civil matter mostly, she said, but the utility theft and possibly the harassment cross into criminal territory. Let me review everything and I'll be in touch. A week went by, then another. I started to think nothing would come of it, that Patricia would just keep getting away with her behavior. Then I got a call from Donald. Adrian, it's Don Hertz from the HOA board. I need to talk to you, but I don't want to violate the restraining order. Can I have my lawyer contact yours to set something up? What's this about? Patricia's gone too far. Some of us on the board want to fix this, but we need your cooperation. I told him to have his lawyer call George. 2 days later, we met at George's office. Donald came with his own attorney, a young woman named Michelle Park. Janice and Kevin were there too, with their own lawyer. We want Patricia removed from the board, Kevin said once we were all settled. We've been compliant with her behavior for too long, and it's put the whole HOA at risk. But we need your agreement not to sue the HOA itself. George leaned back in his chair. Why would Adrian agree to that? The HOA is liable for Patricia's actions. She was acting in her capacity as president. Michelle spoke up. Because if Mr. Owens sues the HOA, he's suing himself too. He's a member. Any judgment comes out of everyone's pockets through special assessments. If we can resolve this by removing Patricia and making specific limited restitution, everyone wins. It was a fair point. I didn't want to destroy the HOA or bankrupt my neighbors. I just wanted Patricia gone and to be left alone. What are you proposing? I asked. Donald pulled out a document. We've drafted a settlement agreement. Patricia resigns from the board immediately and is prohibited from running for any HOA position for 10 years. All fines against you are voided. The HOA pays your legal fees to date. In exchange, you agree not to pursue any further civil action against the HOA as an entity. What about Patricia personally? That's separate. We can't speak for her, and you'd be free to pursue her individually. We're just protecting the HOA itself. I looked at George. He made a not bad expression. What about the harassment? I asked. The water shutoffs, the snow plowing, all of it. Janice spoke for the first time. We've documented everything we know about. Patricia will be held personally responsible. Some of those actions involved HOA contractors, and we'll make sure they understand they were acting beyond their authority. And the barn. The HOA will install its own water connection from the main line, entirely on HOA property. We'll never ask you for utilities or access again. That'll be in writing. It was a good offer, better than I'd expected, but I wanted one more thing. I want a formal apology from the board for allowing Patricia's behavior to continue as long as it did. Kevin nodded immediately. Done. We'll draft something and present it at the next general meeting, publicly. We negotiated details for another hour, but eventually we had an agreement. Patricia would be out, I'd get my legal fees covered, and life could go back to normal. There's one thing you should know, Michelle said as we were wrapping up. Patricia's being investigated by the police. Detective Williams contacted us asking for HOA records related to the water theft and the harassment incidents. I gave her everything we had. That was interesting news. I hadn't heard from Detective Williams in weeks. The settlement agreement was signed 2 days later. Patricia, through her lawyer, agreed to resign rather than face a recall vote that she'd definitely lose. The board held an emergency meeting and accepted her resignation. Donald became acting president until they could hold elections. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning, I was working from home when I saw an unmarked police car pull up to Patricia's house. Detective Williams got out, along with another detective I didn't recognize. They knocked on Patricia's door and spoke with her for a few minutes. Then Patricia came out in handcuffs. I watched through my window, stunned. They put her in the back of the car and drove away. I called George. They just arrested Patricia. For what? I don't know. Williams was the arresting officer, though. George said he'd make some calls. An hour later, he called back. Patricia's being charged with theft of utilities, criminal trespass, and harassment. Apparently, the investigation turned up more than we knew about. She'd been accessing your water multiple times over several weeks, not just the once we documented. She'd also been entering your property without permission to do it. And the pattern of harassment was severe enough that the DA decided to file charges. Will any of it stick? Probably. Pennsylvania takes utility theft seriously, and the evidence is solid. She's looking at fines and possibly probation, maybe community service. This is a first offense for her, so no jail time, but it'll be on her record. Patricia made bail that afternoon. I didn't see her, but I heard from neighbors that she'd been released. The restraining order was still in effect, though, so she couldn't contact me. The criminal case moved slowly. Patricia got herself a criminal defense attorney, and there were preliminary hearings and motions. But the evidence was overwhelming. In June, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to theft of utilities and trespass in exchange for the harassment charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for the water she'd stolen, and for my legal fees that weren't covered by the HOA settlement. The restitution came to about $8,000. Her homeowner's insurance might have covered some of the barn damage, but they denied the claim because she'd been criminally negligent in how she tried to handle the situation. As for the barn, the HOA did eventually install their own water connection, properly permitted and entirely on their property. They also fixed the burst pipes and cleaned up the water damage. The total cost was somewhere around $15,000, which came out of the HOA's reserve fund. That meant higher dues for everyone, which made Patricia even less popular in the neighborhood. By summer, life had returned to something approaching normal. The HOA held elections, and Donald won the presidency legitimately. He was boring and reasonable, which was exactly what everyone wanted after Patricia's reign of terror. I never had to heat the barn. My geothermal system continued to work perfectly, keeping my house comfortable and my energy bills low. The loops under the HOA property stayed there, with written confirmation that I had permanent permission, and the HOA would never interfere with them. Patricia sold her house in August and moved away. I heard she went to Ohio, but I didn't particularly care where she ended up as long as it was far from me. The whole experience taught me several things. First, HOAs can be great if run by reasonable people, but they can be nightmares if power-hungry busybodies get control. Second, documentation is everything. If I hadn't photographed and recorded every interaction, every violation, every incident, I never would have been able to fight back effectively. Third, sometimes standing your ground costs money and time, but it's worth it if the alternative is being pushed around indefinitely. And fourth, never mess with someone's heating system in Pennsylvania winter. It gets cold here and people don't forget. My legal bills, even after the HOA reimbursed me, still cost me a couple $1,000s out of pocket. But it was worth every penny to watch Patricia get led away in handcuffs, and to know that I'd never have to deal with her demands again. The barn still stands there on the HOA property, weathered and old. They never did use it for community events or storage. It's just a barn slowly aging, its pipes safely heated to whatever temperature the HOA chooses without any involvement from me. Sometimes I walk past it and remember the whole ridiculous saga. A woman so entitled she thought she could force her neighbor to heat her barn, who escalated to harassment and theft when she didn't get her way, and who finally learned that actions have consequences. My geothermal system hums away underground, efficiently heating and cooling my house, its loops crossing under that barn's foundation without providing a single BTU of warmth to the structure above. Patricia was wrong about how the system worked, wrong about her authority, and wrong to think she could bully her way to getting what she wanted. The frozen pipes she lied about never existed. The burst pipes that eventually happened were entirely her own fault for trying to steal utilities, rather than properly winterizing or properly heating the structure she was responsible for. The thousands in damage, the criminal record, the forced move, all of it could have been avoided if she just accepted a simple truth. You can't force someone to heat your barn. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My relationship with the HOA is cordial and professional now. Donald and the board leave me alone. I pay my dues and follow the reasonable rules, and life goes on. The story became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents sometimes ask about it, and the tale has grown in the telling. In some versions, I heroically defended my property against an entire corrupt board. In others, Patricia was even more villainous than she actually was. The truth is simpler. A conflict between unreasonable demands and basic property rights, escalated by someone who couldn't accept not getting their way. Detective Williams closed her case with the arrest and conviction. She told me later, during a chance meeting at a grocery store, that Patricia's case was unusual but not unique. HOA disputes regularly crossed into criminal territory, but most people didn't pursue it because they didn't want the hassle or didn't realize they could press charges. "You did the right thing," Williams said. "People like Patricia keep doing what they do because nobody stops them. You stopped her." George sent me a final bill in September, closing out the case. His fees had been substantial, but the combination of HOA reimbursement and Patricia's court-ordered restitution covered most of it. What I paid out of pocket was less than what Patricia had wanted me to spend on heating her barn, which felt like poetic justice. The geothermal installation company sent me a service tech in October for annual maintenance. He checked all the loops, tested the heat pump, and confirmed everything was working perfectly. "Heard you had some trouble with the HOA over this system," he said, while we were reviewing his findings. "Yeah, but it's resolved now." "Good. This is a great installation, should last you 30 years, maybe more. I'd hate to see it messed with because someone doesn't understand how geothermal works." That was the heart of it, really. Patricia never understood the technology. She saw pipes under her property and assumed they were radiating heat that she deserved access to. She never bothered to learn that geothermal loops are closed systems, that they don't leak heat, that they can't just be tapped into like a hot water line. Her ignorance, combined with her entitlement, created a problem that didn't need to exist. When winter came again, I watched the temperature drop and the snow fall, and I stayed warm in my efficiently heated house. The barn stood dark and cold across the property line, its pipes properly winterized this time, nobody trying to heat it with stolen utilities or impossible demands. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd just given in at the start. If I'd spent the money to heat the barn, accepted Patricia's false premise, taken the path of least resistance, I'd be thousands of dollars poorer, still subject to her demands and whims, and she'd still be HOA president, making everyone's life miserable. Standing up to bullies cost something. It cost me time, money, and a lot of stress. But the alternative, living under someone's thumb, accepting unreasonable demands, being harassed whenever I said no, that would have cost more in the long run. The settlement agreement I signed with the HOA included a clause that I particularly appreciated. It stated that my property rights predating the HOA's formation were explicitly recognized and protected. No future board could make demands about my geothermal system, my property usage, or anything else that fell outside the standard HOA purview. Donald had insisted on including that language, and I was grateful for it. Life continued. Seasons changed. The community moved on from the Patricia drama. New controversies emerged. Someone painted their mailbox the wrong color. Someone else's tree was dropping leaves on a neighbor's lawn, but they were minor, normal HOA things that got resolved through reasonable discussion, rather than threats and harassment. I got a dog that summer, a rescue named Cooper. He liked to walk the property boundaries, and sometimes we'd pass the barn. He'd sniff around the foundation, uninterested in the human drama that had unfolded over the structure. To Cooper, it was just an old building with interesting smells. I envied his perspective. The property value in Meadowbrook Estates actually went up after Patricia left. Nobody wanted to admit it directly, but having a reasonable HOA board made the neighborhood more attractive. People considering buying homes in the area would research the HOA, see that Patricia was gone and Donald was running things sensibly, and feel confident about their investment. My house was worth about $40,000 more than when I bought it, though I had no plans to sell. I'd put work into it, the geothermal system, a new roof, updated kitchen, and it was home. The whole barn saga had made me more attached to it, actually. I'd fought for this property, defended my rights to it, and won. That meant something. I ran into Robert Chen, the HOA's former attorney, at a community event in the fall. He was there with his family, no longer in his professional capacity. "How's retirement from HOA law?" I asked. He laughed. "I still do some HOA work, but I'm more selective now." The Patricia situation taught me that some clients aren't worth the headache, no matter how much they pay. She was that bad. Worse. She'd call me at midnight with emergencies that were just her being mad about something. She'd demand I file motions that had no legal basis. And she never wanted to hear that she might be wrong about something. When you exposed the frozen pipe lie, I knew it was over, but she couldn't accept it. "Why did you stick with her as long as you did?" Robert shrugged. "Honestly, inertia at first, and then sunk cost fallacy. I'd invested time into understanding the HOA's situation, and I kept thinking maybe Patricia would become reasonable. She never did. When the board replaced her and asked me to continue, I declined. Michelle Park's doing a great job with them now." We talked for a while longer about HOA horror stories. Apparently, Patricia's behavior, while extreme, wasn't unusual in kind. HOA boards attracted a certain personality-type people who craved authority and control over their tiny domains. Most were harmless, but some, like Patricia, went too far. The criminal probation Patricia was serving included regular check-ins with a probation officer and mandatory attendance at anger management classes. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd violated probation once by missing a community service shift and had been given a warning. After that, she apparently complied with everything, eager to get through the 2 years without further incident. The community service was fitting. She had to work at a county office that handled property disputes and code violations. 8 hours every weekend, helping people navigate the bureaucracy she'd wielded as a weapon against me. I imagined her sitting behind a desk, forced to be helpful and polite, and I felt a certain satisfaction. Donald proved to be an excellent HOA president. He was transparent about finances, held regular meetings where people could voice concerns, and generally operated with common sense. When disputes arose, he mediated rather than dictating. The community thrived under his leadership in ways it hadn't under Patricia. At the annual meeting in November, Donald presented the formal apology the board had promised me. He read it aloud to the full assembly of homeowners, acknowledging that the board had failed in its oversight and had allowed harassment to continue unchecked. It was a genuine apology, not a corporate non-apology, and I appreciated it. Afterwards, several neighbors approached me to say they'd had their own issues with Patricia, but hadn't felt able to fight back. An elderly couple said she'd fined them repeatedly for lawn violations that didn't exist. A single mother said Patricia had threatened to have her car towed multiple times for parking in guest spots. A retired veteran said Patricia had tried to ban him from flying an American flag. "You stood up to her," the veteran said, shaking my hand. "Thank you for that." I hadn't thought of myself as fighting for anyone but myself, but I realized my battle had freed others too. Patricia's removal had lifted a weight from the entire community. The barn became something of a landmark. When giving directions, people would say, "Turn left at the old barn," or "2 houses past the barn." Its presence, once a source of conflict, became just a feature of the neighborhood. The HOA never did find a use for it. It sat there, solid and weathered, a monument to a dispute resolved. My geothermal system continued to save me money. My energy bills stayed low, even as rates increased for my neighbors. Some of them asked about installing their own systems, and I recommended the company that did mine. A few followed through, and gradually, Meadowbrook Estates became known for energy-efficient homes. Donald even updated the HOA architectural guidelines to explicitly allow and encourage geothermal installations, with simplified approval processes. Patricia never contacted me, not directly. The restraining order eventually expired, but by then, there was no need for it. She was gone, her house sold to a nice family with young kids who fit into the neighborhood seamlessly. I never heard from her again. Detective Williams told me that Patricia's case had led to increased scrutiny of HOA disputes in the county. The DA's office had created guidelines for when HOA conflicts crossed into criminal territory, and they were training officers to recognize patterns of harassment and abuse of authority. My case became a teaching example, though the names were changed in the training materials. "You probably prevented future Patricias from doing what she did," Williams said. "That's worth something." George and I stayed in touch. He'd handled other cases for me, nothing dramatic, just normal legal stuff, and we'd become friendly. He told me the Patricia case was one of the most satisfying of his career, not because it was complex legally, but because the outcome was so clearly just. "Most cases are shades of gray," he explained. "But yours was black and white. Patricia was wrong, you were right, and the system worked. That doesn't happen as often as it should." I framed the judge's order denying the injunction and hung it in my basement near the geothermal system controls. It was a reminder of the fight and the victory, a piece of history from a strange chapter of my life. Years would pass. The barn would continue to weather. My heating system would continue to hum. Life in Meadowbrook Estates would continue with the normal rhythms of suburban existence. But for those of us who lived through the Patricia era, there would always be the memory of when an HOA president demanded the impossible, and a homeowner said no and meant it. The lesson resonated beyond just my situation. Know your rights. Document everything. Stand up to unreasonable demands. Get good legal counsel. Don't back down from bullies. These principles apply to HOA disputes and to life in general. As I write this, sitting in my warm house on a cold January evening, I can see the barn through my window. It's dark and empty, exactly as it should be. My geothermal loops run beneath it, doing their job, entirely on my terms. The pipes that Patricia claimed were frozen never were. The pipes that actually burst did so because of her own actions. And the system that she tried to commandeer continues to serve me exclusively, efficiently, properly. I never did heat their barn. I disconnected service and let their pipes burst instead. And in the end, Justice was served, lessons were learned, and life went on. Sometimes standing your ground means watching someone else's structure fail because you refuse to prop it up. That's not cruelty. That's consequence. Patricia learned the difference, and so did everyone else in Meadowbrook Estates. The story has its ending now, written in court records and settlement agreements, in new HOA bylaws and criminal probation terms. But more than that, it's written in the quiet operation of a geothermal system that heats exactly what it's supposed to heat, nothing more and nothing less. The Earth's constant temperature, access through engineering and technology, keeps my home comfortable regardless of what demands anyone makes, and that's exactly as it should be.